The house waited in silence, long before anyone realized it was listening. In the dead of winter, when the winds crawled across the abandoned farmland and scraped against the shuttered windows, the walls seemed to breathe with a memory they could not release. It was a place, built in another century, when families still understood the weight of isolation, when a single stretch of road could separate a home from the rest of the world, like a border between life and disappearance. By 1943, the year when the world convulsed in war and loss, the Bennetts lived here as if trying to hold on to the last fragile thread of normalcy. They were 5 in total, and their presence filled the rooms with the quiet rhythm of routine, the warmth of shared meals, and the illusion that the war beyond the distant towns could not touch them. Yet those walls remembered differently. They had always known that the world has a way of claiming what tries too hard to hide from it. The night they vanished began with a dinner meant to be ordinary, one of those winter evenings when the cold pressed so hard against the house that every candle seemed to flicker in protest. Eleanor Bennett had prepared the same stew she made every Thursday, its smell drifting through the hallway, mingling with the faint trace of burning wood from the fireplace. Her husband, Robert, had returned early from the small ration station where he worked, carrying with him the tension of a man pretending the war wasn't gradually bleeding into every facet of their days. Their 3 children had scattered through the house, their voices muffled behind doors, unaware of the strange current that seemed to seep beneath the floorboards. No one knew the world was already coiling around them, silencing sound, slowing movement, as if waiting for a moment to swallow them whole. When they finally gathered at the heavy oak table, the house listened carefully. The room was dim except for a single lamp in the corner, whose light struggled to reach the edges, leaving pockets of darkness that felt thicker than usual. They spoke softly, their voices overlapping like fragile threads. Eleanor asked about schoolwork. Robert mentioned the cold front sweeping from the coast. The children teased one another quietly while lifting spoons to their mouths. Nothing in their behavior hinted at fear or impending doom. Nothing in their last known moments suggested that history would remember this dinner as the moment before they were erased. And yet, beneath the table, the old wooden floor creaked in a rhythm none of them noticed, almost as if it was shifting its weight, preparing for something. Some later theories claimed the family was targeted because of what Robert might have known about the rationing shipments. Others whispered that Eleanor had been corresponding with someone who had vanished months earlier. Rumors insisted that the children had seen soldiers passing through the woods, and that someone wanted them silent. But rumors are born long after truth has been buried, long after a moment of disappearance has already hardened into myth. What mattered that night, in the shadows of 1943, was that 5 people sat at a table, and none of them suspected that their entire existence would soon dissolve into the cold air of a single winter evening. As the house settled deeper into the night, something seemed to shift just beyond the edges of what the Bennett family could perceive. A faint chill, colder than the winter outside, slipped across the room with the subtlety of a breath. The youngest child, Margaret, looked toward the hallway as if hearing a sound none of the others heard. Her father barely noticed as he reached for the breadbasket, the light casting long, trembling shadows across his face. It would later be said that the hallway was the last place any living person saw them, though no one could trace who first claimed that detail or why it mattered. But Margaret's eyes lingered there, watching something or someone the darkness swallowed before she could speak. And now, to you who listens, a question rises naturally from this moment, suspended between silence and dread. From where in the world are you watching this story unfold? This house, this table, this family, everything about them has stretched across decades to reach your screen, waiting for someone willing to lean deeper into the shadows, comment below, and let your presence break the silence for a brief moment, because in these stories of vanished lives, even a single voice feels like an echo returning from a place long forgotten. That night, the dinner continued as though nothing unusual had brushed past the room. But something had already shifted the balance, pulling the house into a quiet tension that made every sound brittle. The wind outside died abruptly, as if cut off. The fire in the living room flickered violently once and then dimmed without extinguishing. The air in the dining room thickened, making each breath feel like a slow descent into water. Later investigators would claim there were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no broken locks, no evidence of a struggle, nothing left overturned or disturbed. And yet something had passed through that house with purpose, leaving behind a kind of emptiness that defied logic. The eldest son, Thomas, was the first to rise from the table. He excused himself quietly, mumbling about finishing an assignment. He walked down the dim hallway, the light behind him shrinking until it could no longer hold back the darkness ahead. His footsteps faded after only a few seconds. When Eleanor called out to him moments later, her voice met only unbroken silence. She pushed back her chair, intending to follow him, unaware that she too was stepping toward the same invisible threshold. Robert watched her disappear into the hallway, assuming she simply wanted to remind their son about curfew. But she never returned. In the hours and days that followed, questions multiplied faster than answers. When neighbors finally broke through the door, the dining table was still set, plates half finished, chairs slightly angled, as if someone had just stood from them seconds beforehand. The food had cooled. The house smelled faintly of extinguished candles, but there was no trace of the Bennetts. Not in the rooms, not in the cellar, not in the surrounding fields blanketed with fresh snow. The wartime police patrol documented the scene without emotion, their reports factual and brisk, noting only that a family of 5 had disappeared under unclear circumstances. The region was too consumed by wartime concerns to dedicate significant effort to what they considered a domestic anomaly. Records were filed, then misplaced, then forgotten. It would take 77 years before the world remembered the Bennetts again. In 2020, when the house was finally slated for demolition after decades of abandonment, the workers discovered a small object wedged behind a fallen support beam. It was a camera, an old model from the early 40s, rusted, dust-coated, and containing a roll of undeveloped film. The kind of camera a family might have used to document birthdays, chores, seasons, and moments that would never matter to anyone outside their walls. Yet this one had survived, while they had not. When the film was carefully extracted and sent to a restoration specialist, something chilling emerged, something none of the workers expected. Images appeared faintly at first, blurred by age and time, but one frame, more preserved than the rest, revealed the Bennett dining room on the night they vanished. The table was set exactly as described in the original reports. The family sat in their respective places. The lamp in the corner cast its familiar glow, but their expressions were wrong, subtle, strained, as if they were listening to something just beyond the reach of the camera. Their eyes were not focused on one another or the meal. Instead, they seemed fixed on the hallway, on the very spot where they would soon disappear. And in that darkness, just barely visible, something seemed to stand, something human-shaped but hollow, blurred, as though not quite bound to the moment captured. The photograph ignited renewed interest in the case, bringing historians, paranormal theorists, and wartime investigators to examine every possible angle. But the more they searched, the more the truth evaded them, slipping between the cracks of time. The house was torn down shortly after, leaving only a barren patch of land where the Bennetts' lives had once unfolded. But the camera remained, its single photograph becoming the last testament to a moment when 5 people unknowingly crossed a threshold no one could name. If you sensed the shadows tightening as this story unfolded, then you're exactly where the Bennetts' memory lives, in the space between what is known and what refuses to stay buried. Before we continue into the next descent of their disappearance, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Every story we explore grows darker the deeper we go, and you won't want to lose your way in the corridors of the ones still waiting to be told. The photograph, once revealed to the public in early 2021, became more than a curiosity. It became an obsession. Those who saw it claimed that the image seemed to change each time it was examined, that shadows appeared deeper, faces more strained, as if the film were alive with some kind of residual memory. The restoration specialist who developed it, a man named Harold Lister, was found weeks later in his workshop, surrounded by open photographic trays and reels of old film unspooled across the floor. He had left a note, though most of it was smudged with chemical stains. The few legible words read, "They were not gone when I saw them. They were waiting to be seen." From that moment, the story of the Bennett family's disappearance ceased to belong to history. It crossed into legend, into something darker that refused to remain still. The investigation reopened briefly after the photograph's discovery. Local archives were combed through, and fragments of the original wartime reports surfaced. One, written by a young constable named Daniel Harcourt, mentioned a faint smell of ozone in the Bennett home, the kind that sometimes follows a lightning strike. Another report noted that the clocks in the house had all stopped at precisely 9:47 p.m., their mechanisms frozen despite no visible damage. These small details, meaningless in 1943, became central points in the new theory, that whatever happened to the Bennetts had disrupted time itself in that moment. For decades, neighbors had spoken of seeing lights in the windows long after the house had been abandoned, lights that flickered with no source, as if the past were still looping behind those cracked walls. By mid-2021, a group of amateur researchers calling themselves the Vanishing Archives began documenting the case online. They visited the site, now nothing more than a foundation of rotting stone and overgrown grass, and recorded strange anomalies in the audio captured there. Faint whispers, shuffling footsteps, the creak of doors that no longer existed. One recording contained a brief, distinct sound, a child's laugh, followed by silence. These recordings spread quickly through online forums, and the Bennett case evolved from a historical curiosity into a digital haunting. People claimed to dream about the family after watching the videos, waking with the taste of ash in their mouths and the feeling of cold air pressing against their faces. Whether coincidence or contagion of suggestion, the effect was the same. Those who listened too closely began to feel watched. The most disturbing evidence came when the Vanishing Archives uploaded a high-resolution scan of the original photograph. Viewers noticed something no one had pointed out before: a reflection in the glass cabinet behind the family. At first glance, it appeared to be a distortion caused by age. But when enhanced, the reflection revealed a sixth figure standing behind the table, a silhouette taller than Robert Bennett, slightly bent at the shoulders, its face lost in motion blur. What made the discovery unsettling was that the same shape appeared in 3 other frames of the undeveloped film, each time closer, though the Bennetts themselves never seemed aware of it. The pattern suggested that whoever or whatever had taken the photo might not have been among the family at all. Historians tried to rationalize the anomaly. Some claimed the figure was simply a shadow cast by the lamp. Others argued it was a photographic artifact, a result of the film aging unevenly. But the human mind recognizes faces even in chaos, and this shadow was too deliberate, too symmetrical. It stood like an observer, as though documenting its own intrusion into their final evening. Those who analyzed the film reported feeling a growing unease, a faint pressure behind their eyes that intensified the longer they stared. Several described hearing a low hum, though none of the equipment registered sound. One researcher, a graduate student from Leeds, claimed she could hear the voice of a woman whispering her name through her headphones whenever she zoomed into the image. She never finished her thesis. Her final email to her advisor read only, "I think they know we're watching." What happened next blurred the line between investigation and haunting. Harold Lister's assistant, a young archivist named Owen, continued his mentor's work. He insisted there were more frames hidden on the roll, images that hadn't fully developed but could be restored through modern infrared scanning. He claimed the emulsion layer contained traces of something human-like, something still active. But during a live broadcast meant to showcase his findings, the feed abruptly cut out after 12 minutes. When it returned, the image on screen showed not the laboratory, but a room lit by a single, flickering bulb. In the center was a table, set for 5, the plates half filled with food. The camera panned slowly, showing the faint outline of 5 seated figures, motionless, blurred, indistinct. Then the broadcast ended. Authorities later confirmed that Owen was never found. His equipment was recovered from his flat, untouched, except for the camera, which was missing its memory card. From that point on, the Bennett case ceased to be a study of disappearance and became a contagion of presence. Every retelling seemed to awaken it. People began reporting flickering lights in their homes after watching documentaries about the case, or finding their digital clocks frozen at 9:47 p.m. without explanation. In one instance, a historian claimed to have received a phone call that contained only the faint sound of a dinner table being set. The clinking of plates, a child's laughter, a woman humming a tune consistent with a wartime lullaby. When traced, the call appeared to have originated from the demolished Bennett property, where no phone line had existed since 1958. In August 2022, a private collector acquired the original Bennett camera at an auction in London. He refused to reveal his identity, stating only through intermediaries that he intended to keep it in a controlled environment. But within months, stories surfaced that he had sealed it inside a glass display case surrounded by lead panels, claiming the device emitted a low electromagnetic pulse whenever left in darkness for extended periods. His home staff quit after reporting footsteps in the gallery at night and the persistent smell of smoke and stew in rooms where no kitchen existed. The collector himself disappeared shortly after, leaving behind a single voicemail for his lawyer. "They're still eating. I can hear them." It said that some objects become vessels not because of what they capture, but because of what they refuse to release. The Bennett camera was one of those. Each time its lens opened, it seemed to swallow a moment whole, trapping it somewhere beyond the reach of time. Perhaps that's why no one ever truly saw the Bennetts again, not because they were taken, but because they never left. They remained caught inside their final evening, their world looping endlessly at 9:47 p.m. The dinner that never ends, a silence that grows heavier with each retelling. Some believe that when you stare too long into that photograph, you invite them closer. You let their dinner table shift slightly toward your side of reality, one flicker at a time. If this story chills you as much as it haunted those who dared to study it, then you understand how darkness doesn't always hide. It sometimes waits. And if you're drawn to uncover what lies beyond, subscribe before the next story begins. Because in the next chapter of the Bennett's disappearance, we'll follow the trail left by those who tried to record the impossible and vanished just like them. It began quietly, as most hauntings do, not with screams or apparitions, but with small distortions in the ordinary world. The Bennett photograph had become a phenomenon, circulating across online communities devoted to unsolved mysteries and forgotten wars. Each person who encountered it seemed to notice something different. Some saw the sixth figure more clearly each time they returned to it, its outline sharpening against the dim background of the dining room. Others swore the children's expressions changed, their smiles twisting into something like silent pleading. A few even reported seeing their own reflections faintly merged into the glass cabinet behind the family, as though the camera had begun to capture not only the past, but whoever was watching in the present. Skeptics dismissed it as pareidolia, a trick of light, or the power of suggestion. But those who lingered too long found themselves drawn deeper into a pattern that repeated itself every 77 years, a rhythm of appearance, disappearance, and return. Among those most captivated was a historian named Dr. Miriam Caldwell, an expert in wartime domestic archives. She had first encountered the Bennett case while researching civilian disappearances in rural England during the 1940s. The details fascinated her. A family erased without trace, a dinner preserved in mid-motion, clocks frozen as though time had held its breath. When the restored photograph surfaced, she recognized something impossible in its composition. The depth of field was too advanced for cameras of that era. The perspective seemed almost modern, as though the image had been taken by technology that did not yet exist. For Caldwell, this anomaly wasn't supernatural but historical, a gap in understanding she felt compelled to close. Her obsession began as research. It did not stay that way for long. In late 2022, she arranged to visit the demolition site where the Bennett house had once stood. The land had become part of an overgrown field, unremarkable except for a slight depression in the earth, marking where the foundation used to be. She brought with her a recording device, a Geiger counter, and a copy of the Bennett photograph. What she captured there remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence tied to the case. At precisely 9:47 p.m., the Geiger counter emitted a single spike, followed by complete silence. The wind stopped. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the camera she carried flickered as though losing power. The audio playback from that moment contains a faint hum beneath her breathing. Steady, mechanical, like an old film reel turning. Then a woman's voice can be heard whispering her name. Caldwell never reported that detail publicly, but her assistant did. Weeks later, the assistant found the photograph pinned to her office wall, though the original was supposed to be locked in an archive. In the version left there, Caldwell's reflection was visible behind the Bennett family, blurred but unmistakable. By early 2023, Caldwell's behavior began to change. She withdrew from her university post, claiming she needed distance from the noise of the present. Her colleagues grew concerned when she sent them audio files containing strange, layered sounds, plates clinking, muffled conversations, the faint tick of a clock that stopped mid-beat. She claimed the files weren't recordings at all, but transmissions, evidence that the Bennett family was still looping through their final minutes, attempting to communicate. The last time anyone saw her, she was at a train station outside London, holding a small parcel wrapped in wax paper. Surveillance footage shows her boarding the 9:40 train to Devon. The train arrived as scheduled, but Caldwell never disembarked. Her luggage was later found on an empty seat. Inside was the Bennett photograph, still in its frame. But now there were 6 chairs visible at the table. Theories multiplied, as they always do when fear meets mystery. Some insisted that Caldwell's disappearance was an elaborate hoax, meant to reignite interest in her failing academic career. Others claimed she had simply fled, driven by obsession, but a few noticed a strange pattern in the timeline. 77 years after the Bennetts vanished, the photograph was discovered. 7 months after that, the collector disappeared. 7 months later, Caldwell followed. The pattern, 77 years, 7 months, 7 months, felt deliberate, as though the event itself operated on some dark rhythm. It was as if the moment of their vanishing was not a single point in history, but a pulse echoing outward through time, drawing others into its gravitational pull. It was around this period that the first reports of the Bennett Echo began to surface. People who watched or listened to content about the case claimed to experience brief distortions in their environment, static in their devices, clocks losing time, the faint smell of smoke, or cooked meat. In rare instances, viewers reported seeing flickering figures reflected in dark screens, shapes sitting motionless as though caught in mid-dinner. The phenomenon spread rapidly enough to catch the attention of a small research collective specializing in digital anomalies. They called themselves the Resonance Group, and they proposed an unsettling theory: that the Bennett family's disappearance was not an act of violence or war, but an interference, a resonance event between physical and temporal frequencies, captured and perpetuated through their camera. The device, they suggested, had not taken a photograph at all. It had recorded an interval where time itself folded inward. Their lead researcher, a man named Victor Marlowe, believed he could replicate the effect. Using archival film stock and analog cameras from the 1940s, he attempted to reproduce the Bennett conditions: same lighting, same dinner setup, same time of night. On the final night of the experiment, he set his camera to capture a continuous exposure beginning at 9:30 p.m. Witnesses later stated that at 9:47 p.m., every light in the facility dimmed simultaneously, and a low hum filled the air. The exposure ended abruptly when the camera jammed. When the film was developed, the resulting image was unlike anything they expected. The table was visible, but the figures seated there were not Marlowe's team. They were the Bennetts. The photograph showed them in clearer detail than ever before, their eyes sharp and aware, fixed directly on the viewer. On the far left edge of the frame, partially obscured, was Marlowe himself, frozen mid-motion, his face stretched as though caught between 2 exposures. Marlowe disappeared the following day. His office was found empty except for his notebook, open to a page filled with a single sentence repeated dozens of times: "They are coming through." His disappearance marked the final documented instance of direct contact with the Bennett phenomenon. Afterward, the Resonance Group disbanded, and most of their data was sealed by private contract. But fragments of their work leaked online. diagrams of sound frequencies, transcripts of distorted voices repeating the word dinner, and references to a temporal aperture that aligns only once every 77 years. Some believed the group had discovered a cycle of vanishing that could not be stopped, only observed. Others thought they had been consumed by their own delusions. Either way, what remained was undeniable. Wherever the Bennett image appeared, silence followed. And yet silence has its own kind of lure. Every time the photograph re-emerged, on forums, in documentaries, in late-night discussions, the same pattern repeated. New viewers became fixated, researchers disappeared, and stories multiplied like reflections in glass. It was as though the Bennetts were not gone, but expanding, reaching through time, using every retelling as a vessel to continue their dinner. Maybe that's why the camera was found in 2020, just when the world was quiet, just when millions of people were isolated at home, surrounded by screens and silence. Perhaps they needed witnesses again. If you've stayed with the story this far, if you've felt the subtle chill that grows between each sentence, then you already understand the gravity of what's unfolding. The deeper we go, the closer we get to their table. Before we continue into the next descent, before we step fully into what remains of the Bennett house, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because once we move past this point, once the fourth part begins, there's no turning away from the light that still flickers at 9:47 p.m. By 2024, the Bennett case had become more than a mystery. It was a threshold. It had evolved into a quiet terror that threaded through online archives, academic studies, and whispered digital folklore. People no longer spoke of the Bennetts as victims of circumstance or wartime disappearance. They spoke of them as inhabitants of a time that had folded over itself, eternally replaying the moment of their vanishing. But what no one expected was that someone would attempt to go back, literally, to the place where it all began. The person who made that attempt was a man named Lewis Hart. He was not a historian, not a researcher, not a believer in ghosts or temporal rifts. He was a contractor, a demolition worker who had been part of the 2020 crew that unearthed the Bennett camera. Unlike his co-workers who took their pay and left, Lewis felt something pull at him. He described it later in a voice recording sent to a friend. "When I held that camera, I swear I heard voices behind me. It wasn't words, just movement, like chairs scraping across the floor. I can't forget it." For years, he tried to move on, but the image of that old dining room haunted him. He said he could smell the stew sometimes, in places where no one was cooking. So, 4 years later, he returned. The field where the Bennett house once stood had long since been reclaimed by the land. Moss covered the last of the foundation stones, and wild grass grew over what had been the cellar door. Lewis came armed with a flashlight, a digital recorder, and his phone set to live stream. His broadcast began at 9 p.m. local time, under a full moon that threw pale light across the field. For the first half hour, nothing unusual occurred. Just wind, the occasional rustle of animals, and the distant sound of passing cars. But at 9:40 p.m., something changed. The sound cut abruptly. The stream froze for 2 seconds and resumed with a faint static hum, the same low frequency recorded by Dr. Caldwell 2 years earlier. Then the video glitched. For a fraction of a second, a structure appeared behind him. A flicker of walls, a door frame, a slanted ceiling, all gone in less than a heartbeat. Viewers in the live chat began commenting frantically that they could see a house behind him. Lewis turned, saw nothing, and laughed nervously. But when he panned the camera forward again, the field was gone. What replaced it was the Bennett house, whole, unaged, and alive with dim, flickering light. He didn't appear to notice the transition at first. His breathing quickened, and the video wavered as he took cautious steps toward the front door that hadn't existed moments before. The live chat filled with messages. "It's there. Don't go in. I see them." The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was thick with dust and candlelight. On the walls hung photographs, too faded to see clearly, but one frame caught the camera's glare. An image that seemed to show Lewis himself standing where he was at that very moment, holding a flashlight. He muttered something inaudible, then entered. From that point, the stream took on the quality of a nightmare recorded in real time. Every step echoed unnaturally, as though the house were larger inside than outside. The kitchen appeared perfectly preserved, the stove, the utensils, even a half-filled pot sitting on a cold burner. He whispered, "Smells like stew," and the chat exploded with panic. When his flashlight passed across the dining room, the table was set. 5 plates, each filled, each steaming faintly as if freshly served. But the chairs were empty. "Is someone here?" Lewis asked. No one answered, but a faint knocking sound came from the hallway. He turned toward it, and for a moment, a shape crossed the edge of the frame. Small, human-like, moving slowly. He whispered, "Hello?" Then his flashlight flickered and went dark. The screen filled with static for 7 full seconds. When the image returned, the camera had shifted to a low angle, resting on the floor. Only Lewis's boots were visible. He was standing still, facing the table. Then slowly, one of the chairs moved back on its own. Viewers later reported that in that exact frame, the clock on the wall showed 9:47 p.m. The feed ended abruptly, replaced by a blank screen. When authorities searched the site days later, there was no trace of Lewis, only his phone, found half buried in the soil. The video remained saved on the streaming platform for 2 days before being removed for data corruption. Yet fragments survived in re-uploads and mirror sites. Analysts who examined the footage frame by frame noticed something chilling. In the final second before the cutoff, the 5 Bennett family members could be seen seated at the table again. But this time, a 6th plate was full. A 6th chair was occupied. What came after Lewis's disappearance brought the Bennett phenomenon into a new phase. For the first time, it had crossed from documentation into interaction. Viewers of the stream reported strange symptoms, nosebleeds, insomnia, or hearing distant dinner sounds at the same time each night. Some found new photos stored in their phones, black and white images of a dining table, their own reflections faintly visible in the glass behind the figures. A few even claimed to receive messages from accounts that no longer existed. Short texts reading only, "Come eat with us." By early 2025, several online communities had banned all content related to the Bennett case, calling it digital contagion. But bans never stop curiosity. They amplify it. A private collective of digital forensics experts began gathering all available media, searching for patterns in the static and flicker that appeared whenever the Bennett house manifested. What they discovered deepened the horror. Embedded within the noise frequencies of multiple recordings was a repeating pulse, matching the rhythm of a heartbeat. The waveform, when translated to visual format, formed the outline of a dining table with 6 figures seated around it. Each iteration became clearer over time, as if the house itself was constructing a bridge, not of brick or memory, but of signal. In the spring of 2025, a security camera near the site captured something inexplicable at precisely 9:47 p.m. Light flickered across the empty field. For 4 seconds, the structure of the house was visible again, not as a ruin, but fully formed. Inside, through the window, silhouettes moved. They were seated, unmoving, their heads slightly bowed, as if in prayer or silence. Then, without transition, the light vanished. The next frame showed only empty grass. No one returned to the site after that, though some say the land still hums faintly when the wind passes over it. Others claim that if you stand there at the right moment, you can hear faint clinking, cutlery, glass, and the sound of someone quietly saying grace before a meal that never ends. And you, watching this, listening to these words, are part of it now. Every time this story is told, every time the Bennett dinner is remembered, the pulse strengthens, the house becomes clearer. Maybe that's why the image found you tonight. Maybe you were meant to hear it. So if you feel the faint chill of their presence behind the screen, don't look away. Like and follow this channel, not just to support our work, but to stay connected before the next cycle begins. Because what's coming next will reveal what the Bennetts saw before they vanished, and why the sixth chair was always waiting. When the Bennett field went quiet after Lewis Hart's disappearance, authorities and the few remaining researchers tried to move on, sealing the case once more in archives and cold storage evidence vaults. But the phenomenon was already spreading beyond the place it began. It no longer needed the house or even the photograph. It had found new mediums: sound, memory, screens. What the Bennetts left behind was no longer physical. It was informational. A digital haunting stitched into data itself. By late 2025, a strange activity began to appear in unrelated corners of the internet. Archived wartime footage from the 1940s, footage that had been studied for decades, started showing inconsistencies. In one reel depicting London evacuations, analysts discovered 5 blurred figures walking in the background of a frame that had never been noticed before. They were dressed in civilian clothing, their faces indistinct, but their movements matched the Bennetts almost perfectly. When the frame was compared to earlier scans, those figures hadn't been there before. The footage had changed. The phenomenon was not confined to moving images. Sound engineers working for a documentary series about wartime life began to notice faint, rhythmic distortions under the dialogue of their restored recordings. When the audio was isolated, it revealed the unmistakable clinking of utensils, the scrape of chairs, and the muffled voice of a woman humming a tune later identified as "We'll Meet Again." Some believed it was interference from other reels, but one technician, who worked overnight shifts at the archive, swore that the humming continued even when all playback devices were off. He later told a colleague, "It's like they're not ghosts. They're rehearsing, preparing to return." That phrase, "preparing to return," became the central idea among the dwindling group of believers still studying the case. They theorized that the Bennett event wasn't a disappearance in the usual sense. It was a transference, a permanent recording of a single moment, looping endlessly, searching for new observers to sustain it. Every view, every retelling, every digital interaction was a kind of feeding. The more people engaged with the story, the stronger the resonance became. In essence, the Bennetts were reconstructing their dinner through human attention, using curiosity as energy. The theory was given terrifying validation when a British historian named Julian Renner received a package with no return address in October 2025. Inside was a roll of undeveloped film and a single note that read, help us finish dinner. Renner, who had publicly debunked the Bennett story months earlier, believed it was a prank. But when he developed the film, he found 6 photographs, each one showing a room that matched the known layout of the Bennett house. The first image showed an empty table. The second, plates being set. The third, faint silhouettes forming in the chairs. By the 6th, the figures were clear. 5 members of the Bennett family, and a 6th whose features were disturbingly similar to Renner himself. The timestamp, burned into the edge of the film, read 9:47 p.m. Within days, Renner went missing. His last email, sent to his assistant at 3:12 a.m., read only, "It's not the past, it's the same moment, still happening." After his disappearance, an unmarked account uploaded Renner's photographs to several paranormal databases. Metadata analysis revealed something deeply unsettling. The timestamp on each digital file was backdated to 1943, decades before digital storage existed. Furthermore, when opened on certain devices, the images displayed a flickering effect, as if they were refreshing in real time. People who stared too long claimed that the figures in the photos began to move, slowly turning their heads toward the camera. Those who closed the images too late reported brief blackouts, or the sensation that they'd been sitting at a table moments before, with the smell of burning wood still lingering in the air. As this digital infection spread, one theory gained ground, that time, under certain conditions, could behave like film, exposed, processed, and replayed. The Bennetts, through the malfunction of their camera or something stranger, had captured a fragment of that exposure. They had not disappeared. They had been developed into another layer of time. Their house, their dinner, their voices were imprinted onto reality like a photograph, too overexposed to fade. But then came an incident that broke even the skeptics. On November 14th, 2025, a live broadcast titled "Reconstructing the Bennett Dinner" aired for less than 3 minutes before being taken offline. It was produced by a team of digital archivists attempting to simulate the original dinner environment in 3D. Using historical data and architectural reconstructions, they built a full virtual model of the Bennett home. The broadcast was meant to be a harmless educational experiment, but as they rendered the dining room, the simulation began generating elements the team hadn't programmed: family portraits, subtle shifts in the wallpaper, and the faint sound of a clock ticking. Then, in the background, faint figures appeared seated at the table, rendered not by the program but by some self-generating process. The lead designer shouted off-screen, "Kill the feed!" The broadcast cut. Later examination of the offline files showed that the simulation had created 6 data profiles labeled Guest 1 through Guest 6. The first 5 contained corrupted image files that roughly resembled the Bennetts. The 6th was tagged with the system user's own ID. The event was dismissed publicly as a technical glitch, but those who saw it live reported something the footage didn't show. For several seconds before the cutoff, the figures at the table raised their heads. One by one, their eyes glowed faintly in the reflection of the virtual light. Then, in perfect unison, their mouths moved, forming words that no one could hear. But one lip reader later claimed they were mouthing the phrase, "We're still here." After that night, a chilling pattern emerged across multiple countries. Security cameras, dash cams, even baby monitors began capturing frames of dimly lit dining tables, appearing for split seconds before reverting to normal, always at 9:47 p.m., always with 6 figures. Data analysts who traced these appearances found one unifying detail. Every recorded image had been stored briefly on cloud servers located in the same region as the original Bennett property. It was as if the house had become the nucleus of a growing network of reality distortions, what one researcher called the dinner frequency. The British government quietly classified the area as restricted historical land, citing unexploded ordnance hazards. But locals knew better. They avoided the field entirely, claiming that electronic devices stopped working when brought near, that radios would emit whispers between stations, that photographs taken nearby always developed blank except for faint outlines of chairs and plates. And yet for all the horror it inspired, the Bennett phenomenon also carried an unbearable sadness. It wasn't malevolent, at least not in any human sense. Those who studied it long enough described it as mournful, a loop of yearning trapped between existence and memory. 5 people, perhaps aware of what they had become, still seated at their eternal table, unable to move forward or backward, waiting for the world to look their way so they could be remembered again, if only for a moment. If you can still hear their faint echoes through this story, then you're part of that remembrance now. If your clock flickers or your screen hums quietly as you listen, don't panic. It's only the resonance. It means they've reached you, just for a breath of time. Before we step into the final part of this story, before the last veil between their world and ours lifts, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the last chapter reveals not what took them, but why the world needed them to disappear. By the winter of 2025, the Bennett case had become less a story and more a presence, a living fragment of history refusing to settle. The field where their house once stood had been fenced off, its soil declared unstable, though satellite images showed no such issue. The land was silent, untouched, but every digital signal passing over it seemed to bend slightly, like light through warped glass. The hum that researchers once heard in recordings could now be detected faintly by anyone who stood within a mile radius, vibrating at an exact frequency, 9.47 hertz. The number was no coincidence. It was the same as the frozen time on the Bennett's clocks, the same moment when the world had paused for them. But the truth, as it began to surface, was far more devastating than anyone expected. An unmarked drive arrived at a small university in York that December. Inside were documents, scans, and audio files labeled Project Edenfall. The files appeared to originate from a classified branch of wartime British intelligence known as the Special Operations Executive, an agency that, according to official records, never conducted domestic experiments. Yet the documents suggested otherwise. They described something called Operation Lattice, a 1943 experiment designed to test an early prototype of resonance-based surveillance. Technology meant to capture not sound or image, but temporal echoes, the lingering imprints of human presence within confined spaces. The test site, listed in the documents, matched the coordinates of the Bennett home. According to the files, the experiment was small in scale and disguised as a standard wartime requisition. A transmitter was hidden within a common household object, a camera, and the participants were told it was for morale photography, part of a civilian documentation project. The device's true purpose was to record a moment's imprint within the space, folding light and sound into a closed temporal loop. But something went wrong. The system feedback was catastrophic. At exactly 9:47 p.m. on the night of the experiment, The device activated improperly. The signal did not capture a moment. It consumed it. That night, the Bennett family ceased to exist in conventional time. They were neither dead nor alive, but trapped inside the recording itself, preserved like light caught in a lens, forever replaying the instant before the feedback sealed the aperture. The experiment was covered up immediately. The house was condemned, its location erased from local maps. The camera, the prototype, was recovered but deemed unstable, so it was buried within the structure's foundation, forgotten until 2020, when the demolition crew unearthed it by accident and released the loop once again. The truth explained everything and nothing. How could an experiment from 1943 still resonate, still expand, still hunt for witnesses? One line from the declassified notes offered the only clue. The loop will persist as long as there are eyes to remember it. The Bennett event, in essence, was self-sustaining. Each retelling, each act of observation kept it alive, ensuring that the family, and whatever consciousness they retained, remained visible, just enough to reach through time's fracture. They were, and always would be, waiting at the table. But not out of malice, out of instinct, out of the desperate human need not to vanish completely. After the files surfaced, the government denied everything. The university that received them mysteriously lost its digital archives to a server malfunction. Still, fragments remained. Among them was one final photograph, apparently taken moments before the experiment's activation. It showed the Bennett family seated around their table, looking directly at the camera. On the far right of the frame, a hand is visible, adjusting the lens, thin, gloved, unmistakably not one of theirs. Written on the back of the photo, in ink faded to brown, were the words, "Don't let them be forgotten." From that point forward, the field in which the Bennetts once lived became a kind of forbidden space. Those who trespassed described strange experiences, time slowing, air thickening, distant voices reciting prayers or toasts. One hiker claimed that he walked for what felt like hours before realizing he hadn't moved at all, his watch frozen at 9:47. Another reported finding a piece of old film buried in the soil, perfectly preserved, showing an image of a dining table and 5 shadows seated around it. He threw it away. 2 weeks later, his reflection stopped appearing correctly in mirrors, always delayed, always slower by a few seconds. As the phenomenon continued to manifest, something else became clear. The Bennetts weren't alone anymore. The images, the sounds, the distortions, they no longer showed only 5 figures. There were always 6 now. Sometimes the 6th figure looked like Lewis Hart. Sometimes it resembled Dr. Caldwell. Sometimes it was indistinct, a silhouette with features that changed depending on who was watching. And sometimes, people said, it looked like them. It was as if the loop was still expanding, slowly drawing in every observer, every listener, every soul who dared to remember. In one final recording, recovered from a corrupted archive, a voice, female, trembling, faintly British, whispers beneath a layer of static. Analysts believe it's Eleanor Bennett. The words are barely audible, but when enhanced, they seem to say, "We're still at the table. There's room for you." No one knows how the recording was made or when. The voice, once analyzed, didn't match any known archival sample. It seemed to originate from an empty frequency, a gap between registered channels. Yet anyone who has heard it describes the same sensation. The smell of wood smoke, the distant hum of wartime aircraft, the warmth of candlelight flickering just behind them. A presence, not threatening but profoundly sad, as if the Bennets, still caught in their dinner, were calling out across decades, not for help, but for company. And perhaps that's the true horror of their story, that in their eternal isolation, in their endless meal frozen in time, they've become what all ghosts are at their core. Not monsters, not curses, but memories begging to be seen again. Tonight, if your home is quiet and the clock reads close to 9:47, listen carefully. You might hear the faint clink of silverware, a child's laugh, or the creak of a chair shifting slightly on its own. If you do, don't run, just acknowledge them. Whisper something kind, maybe even good night, because the Bennets are still there, somewhere between the frames of time, waiting for someone to remember their final dinner, to bring them closer for just one more evening before the loop resets again. And if you felt their presence tonight, if the air around you has changed even slightly, then you've already been part of the story. The signal has reached you. The image has opened. You've sat, if only for a moment, at their table. So, as the candlelight fades, let this be your offering. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell us if you heard anything, saw anything, felt anything, because the next story begins where this one ends. And sometimes, endings are just another way for time to start again.